Hey everybody, KC here. And as you can see, I am joined today by Michael Sansolo. And one of the reasons I kind of wanted to do this today was because about 2.5 weeks ago, um, Michael's dad passed away. And I had the opportunity, I was lucky enough to go to the memorial service for him. I will say that Michael and I and our spouses were among the youngest people in the room. How old was your dad when he passed away?
There's two great stats about my dad. And Kevin, I want to thank you for letting me do this today. My dad was 3 months away from turning 98, but the number that really gets people, he was 5 weeks from being married for 75 years to my mom, who is, by the way, don't anyone tell that I told you this, but she's 94 and she is still alive and kicking.
Wow. Um, it's remarkable. I mean, and clearly a right in the middle of that whole greatest generation
Mhm.
thing, and he did serve in the well,
He was in the Navy in
he was
World
in the
War.
Navy. Um, so just talk a little bit about your dad, because he was somebody who actually worked in the food industry, although not in the industry that you and I have written about for so long.
And again, I really appreciate Kevin letting me do this today. When I talked about my dad, I have two sisters who are very articulate, really smart, and I knew I had to speak. I'm the middle child, so I was speaking between them. So as I said to the crowd that day, I wanted to talk about things that were unique to my relationship with my dad, and there were two really big ones. The first was I'm the only son, and my dad loved sports, and he was going to turn me into a baseball player. He'd come home from work every night and he would throw grounders to me, high pops. And let me just admit this right out. If this was the big thing my dad tried to do in his life, it was an abject failure. I never became the baseball player he hoped I would be. But it wasn't because of him, it was because of me. And he taught me a lot in doing that. He taught me, first of all, how much the attention meant to me. I always felt my dad always made time to do that. And I knew I was disappointing him as I was striking out and making errors, but he always believed in me. I think
Well,
that
and we'll talk about what your dad did for a living in a second. But one of the things that you talked a little bit about was during the service was how he would come home from work, he would be
dog tired,
dog
yeah.
tired, and would still find time to go out in the back and grab a glove, get you out there and have a catch, which is
Um,
so in some, I mean, he in so many ways, I listened to that. I said he wasn't just trying to teach you how to be a baseball player. He was actually teaching you how to be a father.
Absolutely. I
A
actually I
parent,
talked
I
to
should say a parent,
a
not
parent,
not a
yes.
father, how to be a parent.
I had my son was at the service and I was talking to him afterward and I said, you have to understand, as children of the 50s, which you and I are, Kevin, dads back in that era, if you look at the old television shows, you look at the movies, dads were sort of these above the fray characters. They were avuncular, father knows best. He came home from work, he had his pipe, maybe he had a little drink, but it was mom who did the kids. And in my household, and we never thought about it at the time, my dad was in there all the way. And he did. He taught me about being a parent, taught my sisters about it. And I watched my son, who I'm now a grandfather, and we've talked about that on Morning News Beat. And I watched my son 15 months into this incredible journey and the amount of effort he gives his toddler daughter. And I give my dad a lot of credit for all of that because he showed us that a father can be touchy-feely, can play. And as you said, Kevin, my dad would come home from work dog tired.
Talk
So,
talk about what he did for a living.
all right. And what my dad did for a living, my dad did not have some highfalutin job. He was not a writer from Morning Newsbeat out making speeches like Kevin and I do. My dad always ran restaurants in New York City. And I think a lot of people think, oh, that must be something like they saw in Sex and the City, some high-end thing. No, he ran what are called luncheonettes, where people would come in either for breakfast, for coffee and eggs, or at lunch, a burger, and
Like on Seinfeld.
like on Seinfeld.
Right. Okay.
And one of the elements of it, and this was a very New York City thing, and now it has become national, is that at lunchtime, people from their offices would call the restaurant, order lunch, and they had a group of delivery boys who would run it up to all these office places. And when I got old enough, I went to work for my dad. because he felt this was a great summer job. I'd learned customer service. I'd learned how to handle money. But the most important thing I learned, I watched my dad work, and I learned I don't want to do this as a living. As I would say to my sisters and my mom, when it was hot, it was too hot. When it was cold, it was too cold. And he was on his feet for however many hours a day. He never got to sit down. So when I said he would come home dog tired, I had no idea how tired he was until I worked with him, and I realized he was just giving it all he had every day. And he had some goals. He wanted his children to have the chance to go to college. All three of us did, which was, we can't thank him enough for that. It's interesting because on Morning Newsbeat, we always talk lessons. And as I've been thinking about my dad these past couple weeks since he passed away, considering I never did anything in the rest of my life, like delivering food from a restaurant, but I did learn a lot of lessons. I learned that when you're dealing with a customer, that customer is the most important person you've got at that. And if you show them that, you get rewarded. I would do very well on tips because he told me, you got to smile at the people. You have to thank them for the order. And, they'd look at me. So I was like a 16-year-old kid, and I wasn't what they were expecting. And so it really worked well. I think the biggest lesson he gave me is one day I showed up around 3 minutes late to start my shift. And about an hour later, because we were busy, he called me over. He said, well, you got here at 9:03. And I was like, yeah, the train was running a little late. He asked me what train I was on. I told him, and he said, if you could fly, you wouldn't have made it from the station to the restaurant by 9 o'clock. Your job isn't to be here at 9. Your job is to be ready to work at 9. And I learned from that punctuality is a tough thing. Sometimes you got to, in your mind, be thinking, I've got to be early in order to be on time. So along with the many things he taught me as a dad, he also taught me as a boss. And by the way, I got scolded sometimes as a boss to an employee, that if I was not getting things done properly, he would tell me in no uncertain terms that I did that. And I think we talk a lot about mentoring. Kevin, you and I discuss that all the time with all the generations in the workforce, that people have to mentor in many ways. And it's not always pat on the back. Sometimes it's saying, here's how you could do better. And even though my career never followed what my dad did, his mentoring worked for me. I've been at this a long time, and I can still hear his words on a lot of things I do. The customer is always the most important person.
I know you would occasionally, not in recent years, you would bring them to things like when you were at FMI, you would bring them to the FMI show. And and their mind, right? Their minds just were blown, in part because when if you've never been there before, going to an FMI show doesn't exist anymore. Is just overwhelming. But then also the notion of seeing you on stage, right? I mean, was just a mind blowing for them. Writing 2 books,
Yeah.
writing 1 book and co-writing another book. I mean, this is the stuff that generation really understood in a way they wouldn't understand. Well, I'm sorry, you write on a blog every
No,
other
that didn't make any sense.
you do
But Kevin,
Zoom conversations? What?
let me throw in one story, and everyone should understand that my parents loved the books.
Right.
But my parents loved Kevin's part of the book. It made me crazy. It still does, because my mother will quote Kevin, and I'll say, Mom, I wrote half that book. And she's like, yeah, but I like Kevin.
A woman of impeccable taste, may I say.
Impeccable to absolutely.
Listen, although, so I mean, I got to know your parents a little bit, not really well, but because you and I, they were in Florida at one point. Yeah, I remember I went to visit them. I saw them at the the nursing home they've been living in. I've seen them a number of times over the years, and I'll still never forget going to see them in Florida. And she just took one look at me and said, "You look thin, you should eat more." And I said, nobody else ever to me.
Well, and I got to give one story about my father, because I brought him to an NGA show where I was speaking, and I do my speech. It was a general session. And I had told my parents after the speech, I've got to get rid of my microphone. I have to talk to some people. And they had badges. And I said, explained what the exhibit floor was. And I said, go out there, I'll find you. I walked onto the exhibit floor. It's maybe 15 minutes. And the first booth was an ice cream booth. And as I walked by, the guy in it says, oh, we met your dad. I was like, what do you mean you met my dad? He said, he's been there 3 times. So by the time I found my dad, his first words to me were, they give you ice cream for free? I was like, Dad, you got to pace yourself at these things. He did not pace himself. He spent maybe 2 hours on the floor and he was in his glory. And I'll never remember what ice cream company it was. Hopefully there's someone who's going to get back to us and say, that was me. He ate chocolate ice cream all day long.
We had a bad quarter that year because of your dad. And I love this. You didn't talk about this, but your sister did. Your dad loved Broadway musicals, right?
Loved him.
He would, that was his thing.
And again, we've talked about this here on Morning Newsbeat. My son is a classical musician, but he has played in the pit orchestras of touring Broadway companies. And my dad, it just hit home with my dad. Every time he would talk to my son, he would mention some obscure music from, it could have been 1934, and ask my son if he was playing that, to which my son would be like, I've never heard of it. And if my son were here right now, he would say, Papa, which is what he called my father. He said, Papa had some of the worst taste in music, my God, but he loved opera. And actually, when my son's senior recital, he went to a conservatory, and in his senior recital, he performed one operatic number, Nessun Dorma, which I think is from Traviata, or I don't know, Il Trovatore, whatever. But he performed it in honor of my dad because he was in the audience and he knew my dad loved that song. So he performed Nessun Dorma for my dad. And it's just amazingly cool. And the other thing I mentioned is my dad did get to meet my granddaughter, and they were the oldest and youngest in our family, separated by 96.5 years. And they did get to meet. And my dad really enjoyed that moment. He had 4 great grandchildren. And again, he had a great life in a lot of ways.
And we're not going to go into details, but he also made you a Mets fan.
He made the whole family Mets.
Yeah,
We're
so
4 generations.
We'll let that go for the moment. Hey, listen, it's just, I will tell you that it was an extraordinary service. Your dad was an extraordinary guy. Your mom remains an extraordinary person. And I can only tell you, and I don't know if your wife looked at you and said this on the way out of the service, but mine looked at me and said, you think our kids would say nice things like that about us?
It's a discussion.
Who knows?
You know what? We can't count on it. Let's hope.
No. Well, but hopefully we have a few years before we have to worry about that.
Yes. And again, thank you for letting me do this today.
Oh, listen, thank you for sharing it. Special people and who deserve to be remembered in however we can do it, and give them a moment in our particular spotlight. So anyway,
thank you,
Michael, great to see you as always, and we'll talk soon.
All right, take care, Kevin.
Take care.